Hi, I'm Jilly G. Welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you something that I've shown you before, but I thought it would be good to just have an exclusive video for pie crust. Gluten-free, of course, and the recipe I'll be showing you today is for a single pie crust, which is just the bottom. Of course, in my book and in other videos, there is a double crust recipe as well. And that would be if you're making a fruit pie or something like that, like an apple pie, where you want the bottom crust and then the top crust. But this is just the single bottom crust, and I'm going to pre-bake it for you. Really minimal ingredients. And I've got my pie dish, I've got some parchment paper, cooling rack of course. I have a jar of rice that I use as a pie weight. You can use beans, or if you actually have pie weights. If you don't have any of those, you don't have to use any kind of weight at all. But sometimes in my many years of making pie crusts, for most of those years I didn't use any type of weight. And my pie crust would always seem to shrink on one side. And it was fine. It is what it is. Anyway, so I've since changed and I've started using some sort of weight just to keep my pie crust from shrinking. And then I'm using butter. You could use shortening, vegetable shortening. I've used coconut oil in pie crust before, but not as the entire fat component. If you've made a pie crust before using all coconut oil, let me know how it turned out. I'm curious to see how it would work. I just have not done it yet. Of course, you can use lard, whatever you prefer for your pie crust for the fat. So in this bowl, I have a 1/3 cup plus 1 tablespoon of butter. And because I'm using a pastry blender, I've had my butter sitting out on the counter. It's not super soft, but it's not really firm either. If you've ever tried to cut butter in with a pastry blender and it's super cold, it will get stuck and it's a lot harder to manage. If you're using a food processor, you could have your butter straight from the fridge. But I've always noticed that something like shortening that is mostly solid at room temperature is super soft and easy to work in with a pastry blender. So I try and mimic that with my butter temperature to be soft enough that it's not really difficult. And for just a single pie crust, it's just 1 cup of flour, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and 1 egg. And then I do have some extra flour here for rolling. Of course, parchment for rolling, rolling pin. I always have a knife and a fork for stirring, and then the knife is to get out the bits that stick in my pastry blender. And then I do have cold water in the fridge. So the first thing I'm going to do is get my egg ready, and my egg is also at room temperature. And I'm just going to mix up my egg just so it's really combined, the yolk and the white are combined. You could make this recipe just using an egg white if you want to. Because my flour blend does not have xanthan gum, this is the binder that will keep our pie crust together. If you're not using eggs for some reason, you could just use 1/2 or 1 teaspoon of xanthan gum or whatever your binding choice is. But this is why I use the egg. So with my butter, I'm just going to dump in my 1 cup of flour and 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And then you just start cutting in your butter. If you don't have a pastry blender, you can use 2 knives and crisscross, or you could even just rub it between your fingers. And I've mentioned before, making pie crust is really intimidating for a lot of people, but I have actually found that it's less intimidating to make a gluten-free pie crust. We don't have to worry about overworking the dough and developing gluten. So it's not a concern, which is actually a more forgivable pie crust to work with. And you'll notice how the butter builds up on the sides. And you'll see that my butter is cutting in very nicely. It's not so soft that it is just mushing together and making a paste. Once your mixture starts to look like this, where the butter pieces are getting smaller and smaller, but they're still in pretty good chunks, what we're looking for is pea-sized pieces of dough. It's pretty crumbly, there's still big pieces of butter, but they're not super big. Now this is what we are looking for right here. Bring back our egg. So the process is the same if you're making a double crust pie or a single crust. Of course, double crust you have more butter and more flour and more salt. Still 1 egg and then water. With a double crust, of course, it takes a little bit longer to work in because you've got double the amount. There's my cup of cold water. I always add my egg in first. That way I don't add in too much water later. If you were to add in water first, you might think your dough is coming together nicely, but then you have to add in your egg and it might yield too wet of a dough. And then you would have to add more flour. So I always start with the egg first. And I've mentioned before, weather really does affect a pie dough. If you live in a humid climate, you might not have to add as much water. And it really is something that once you make enough times, you really get a feel for what it's supposed to look like and how it's supposed to act. And once it starts looking a little bit like scrambled eggs, you know you've got it. There's still quite a bit of flour and dry pockets, but there's not really runny bits of egg floating around. So this is where we start adding water just a little bit at a time. My oven is ready. And once it starts looking like this, where there still is little bits here, but it's not super powdery like flour. It's kind of in big chunks or even small chunks, just like this. If you pick up a piece of dough and lightly press it together, it holds its shape, but can still crumble apart if you want it to. So this is exactly what we're looking for. If you were making a 2-crust pie, you would have, of course, a lot more dough. With a 2-crust pie, it depends on the pie dish. If you're using a super deep pie dish, you would not divide your dough exactly in half. You would use a bigger portion of it for the bottom. And then I just get all of the dough and kind of squish it together. You don't need to be super firm, but you want it to hold its shape into a ball. And because it will still crumble apart in some spots, you'll notice at this point, it does feel wet. It's not super tacky and it's not really sticking to my hands, but you might feel that it's a little bit too wet. But if you push hard enough, it will crack apart. So at this point, you don't want to add in a lot of extra flour because it will make it crumbly. But it is holding together nicely, and I'm just using a little bit of the heat of my hands to keep it together. And then if there's super dry pockets, pushing this together will help make it one ball of dough. I hope I'm explaining this right. And I didn't use hardly any water today. So parchment paper and my little bit of extra flour. I flatten it out a little bit just to give it a little bit of a head start before I start rolling. This is also the point that you could wrap this in plastic wrap and stick it in the fridge until you're ready to use it. You could also wrap it in plastic wrap and put it in the freezer. And then your pie crust is ready when you are. I've even heard of people that will put their pie crust in a pie dish and put that in the freezer. I've not had any success with that. My freezer is usually too full to fit a pie dish in there, but I also worry that something might fall in and gouge out my dough. But if you have a freezer that's big enough, by all means, do that. And then just keep it moving. I've been making pies and pie crust for over 20 years, closer to 25 years. So for most of those years, it was for gluten-filled pie crust. But because I was so experienced with making pie crust, it wasn't too difficult to transition to gluten-free pie crust. Of course, it took a couple of trial and errors and failures before I got just right what would work. In all of those years of making pie crust, I used to just roll it out on the counter with some flour. But with gluten-free pie crust, for some reason, parchment paper makes it so much easier. And you can see it is cracking here a little bit in the middle. And that's just fine. You can actually just squish it together. But you really want to keep it moving so it doesn't stick. And if your cracks get even bigger like this and it's harder to squish it back together, just squish it all back together. Give it a really good knead and start rolling again. Keep it moving. And I try and keep it as much in a circle as possible. You can even turn your parchment paper. Make sure to keep your dough moving. If you keep moving the parchment paper and not your dough, it might end up sticking. And then periodically, I feel the thickness of my dough, making sure that it's all the same thickness. You don't want one side super thick and the other side is pretty skimpy. And then I also make sure that it isn't sticking to my parchment paper. And the parchment paper is really helpful to flip over one side and just make sure that you do have flour underneath it. And then I just double check that it's not stuck anywhere. Be a little gentle, it will break apart. And once you think you're getting to the size that it will fit in your pie dish, I always just hold my pie dish over the top, and you want it to be a little bit bigger than the pie dish. And it looks like I need to go just a little bit bigger, not much at all. Make sure your rolling pin has flour, and then I usually sprinkle a little bit of flour on top. And then use the parchment paper to help you. And we're going to very gently roll this pie crust around our rolling pin. Very, very carefully. Bring over your pie dish. Lift up your dough and your rolling pin and then gently unroll it. Try to center it on your pie crust, which mine did not. So now we just need to very gently move it, and it will crumble apart sometimes, so just be careful. And you can just piece it back together. You want to just very gently ease it into the pie dish, and if you have any little cracks, just squish them back together. And where it's overlapping a little bit right here, I just press that together too. And I don't have a lot of excess overhang. So what I do is just pull some of this off and set it aside, because you'll see that some edges don't have as much as some of these other ones. Now I start making my edge, where you just very gently fold over your edging here and gently press it together. You want to make sure it's all the same thickness all the way across the pie. This way it bakes evenly as well. And you'll notice there are edges that don't have as much dough. You could just take some of your scraps and press it on and make your edge. And over here it's a little skimpy. And my favorite edging to make is this simple one right here. There are so many different edgings, and it's just a matter of moving your fingers a different direction. But this edging is my favorite. So this dough recipe makes enough to fill a 9-inch pie dish. If you have an 8-inch pie dish, of course, it would have a lot more excess dough, depending on how thin you roll your crust. I've noticed in all these years of making pies, I would get a lot of comments. Do you make a really thick crust? Do you make a really thin crust? So many people have a preference. If you prefer a thicker crust, then make it a thicker crust. If you prefer a really thin crust, roll it out thinner. It really is up to you. But again, this is one basic recipe that makes a 9-inch pie dish. It would make an 8-inch pie dish as well. If you're using a deep dish pie dish or even a 10-inch pie dish, you might want to make a double crust pie dough recipe, because then you will have enough to make a larger crust. And then of course, if you have enough excess dough, you can just bake that up, and if you're using sugar, sprinkle cinnamon sugar on it or something like that. Or just roll it out, bake it, spread on some honey, and eat it. Now that we've got our dough all rolled out and put into our pie dish, my same fork, I'm going to dock it. And docking is just making holes all over it. And the purpose of docking it is so it doesn't develop big bubbles and puff up, and then you've got a lump in your crust that won't be filled with filling. So I just go along the entire bottom and the sides. Now this is the point where you can stick it in the fridge and chill it before we bake it. If it's really hot in your kitchen or it's a really hot day, you might notice that your pie crust is a little bit difficult to work with. If that happens, you just stick it in the fridge and let it firm up a little bit. Even though my dough is still pretty firm, I want it to be chilled just enough so when I put in my parchment paper and my rice, it's not so soft that it will gouge my pie crust. So into the fridge for about 15 minutes. So now that it's nice and chilled, again, my oven is preheated to 400. I have a piece of parchment paper here that is already kind of crinkly, but you want to crinkle it, a good 3 or 4 times. Be careful not to tear any really big holes in it, because you don't want your rice or beans or pie weights to fall through and make a dent in your crust. But the reason I always crinkle up my parchment paper is it really fits in better, and it's easier to work with than a flat piece of parchment paper that doesn't really fit into a pie dish without gouging your crust or your pie dough. And just very carefully fit the parchment paper onto your pie crust. And because our pie dough is chilled, it is a little firmer, so it won't be gouged as easily, but still be gentle. You don't want to mess up the edging that you made. And once you've got that in there, I've got a quart-sized jar of rice. Just dump that in, and then I push it all the way to the edges. That way, where my parchment paper isn't quite touching the side, it won't create a bubble. Once you've got your rice or your beans or pie weights, whatever you're using, pretty well up against the sides of your pie crust or pie dough, I keep calling it crust, it isn't a crust yet, we'll go in the oven for about 8 to 10 minutes. My pie crust has been in the oven for about 8 minutes. At this point, I remove the rice very carefully. And I put it on a cookie sheet in case there's any holes in the parchment paper. Then your rice is pretty well contained. And then once it's cooled off, I'll put it back into my jar. It is not cooked all the way through yet. So at this point, if you ever have a recipe that calls for a partially baked pie crust, this is what they mean. But because we want this to be fully baked, I'm going to put it back in the oven. That 8 minutes with the pie weights will have set the sides enough that it shouldn't puff up or shrink. So back into the oven for about 5 more minutes. You could have put an egg wash on your pie crust and then finished baking it, and that would give it a nice protective barrier for whatever filling you choose to put in there, such as a cream filling or something like that. If you have a somewhat wet filling, you don't want your crust to get soggy. But I've never had trouble with a soggy crust. So now that my pie is fully baked, I look for it to get golden brown around the edges. You could even go a little bit longer, but I also touch the bottom and see how flaky it feels. This is about as done as I like my pre-baked pies to get. I find that any anymore, and it goes from golden brown to really dark brown very quickly. So now your pie crust is ready. All you have to do is wait for it to cool off to room temperature before you fill it with whatever you're filling it with. And I don't know if you could see that or not, but this side of my pie crust is shrinking just a little bit. And that's just fine. There will actually be a little bit more shrinkage after it cools off a little bit more. If you saw my pie video for pumpkin pie and my pecan pie video, you'll notice that my crust was a lot taller than what the filling was for. And so I don't mind if it actually shrinks down a little bit because my filling won't come all the way up to the top. So I don't mind. But if you have a smaller pie dish, like an 8-inch pie dish, you would make sure that it is all the way kind of over the edge. But it looks really good. And I do have a little piece that's come off there right there, but it's okay. It's a homemade pie. It's a perfect pie crust for a cream pie, a lemon meringue pie, chocolate cream pie, coconut cream, banana cream, all of those different kinds of pies, some of which are in my cookbook. And it's also, at this point, you could put this in the fridge or the freezer and save it for tomorrow or next week, something like that, and then just let it come to room temperature before you fill it. If you have a pie crust like this in the freezer and you're concerned that it might have gotten soggy from being in the freezer, just throw it back in the oven for just a couple of minutes and that should help crisp it up. So once my rice is all cooled off, I will pour it back into this jar and store it. I have a little note on the lid that says what it's for. That way I always know that this is the rice that I use for my pies, and I do the same thing with a jar of beans. That way you know that it's not for eating necessarily, it's just for pies. If you reuse it like I do, you'll notice that it kind of changes the texture, and sometimes it might get some butter or something, or flour or something like that, and you don't really want to cook with that. I suppose you could in an emergency, but after being heated and cooled so many times, I'm not sure if it's really edible anymore. But it's perfect. You can reuse them forever as far as I know. I hope you have found this video helpful. And maybe you've been a little bit nervous to try a pie crust, but it really is so easy to work with. Even if you have a pie dough that you have to squish back together and roll again, as long as you don't add in too much extra flour, it will really stay flaky and hold a slice. And if you're not quite sure, go back and watch one of my other pie videos and you'll see what I mean. If you've enjoyed this video, go ahead and push the like button. That helps me to know that you really are enjoying my videos. And as always, thank you so much for everybody that watches my videos. Thank you so much to my patrons. This channel would not be what it is without the support of you guys. I so appreciate that you are here supporting me. And if you know anybody that might find it useful to learn how to make a gluten-free pie crust, share it with them. Share it with your friends and family. Even if you're not gluten-free, it's still really useful on how to make a pie crust. But thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and do that. If you have any requests for what kind of pies you'd like to see me make with a pre-baked pie shell, let me know. Put those in the comments below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.